Hey guys, this lecture will focus on the fixed exchange rate and how the government can fix the exchange rate to a certain price. Now we've talked about the floating exchange rate as being the exchange rate determined by the market forces of demand and supply. And so when we put our money into the international foreign exchange market, the value of the dollar or the value of certain currencies are determined by the free forces of supply and demand, and that's how the fundamental value of any exchange rate is determined. So we're just going to remind ourselves of this using a graph. So we have exchange rate, so let's just say is AUD to USD, for example, and then we have the quantity of money supplied, an upward sloping supply of money and a downward sloping demand of money. And here we have the fundamental value of the Australian dollar. And as we can see, it's at the point where supply meets demand and the market is at equilibrium. Okay, so that's the concept of the floating exchange rate. We're going to look at how the government can fix the exchange rate. So they can either fix the exchange rate as being an overvalued exchange rate, overvalued, or they could fix it to be undervalued. And this has very large consequences to the external stability or even the balance of payments of a country. So we're going to look at this one by one. So first we're going to look at how the government can overvalue its exchange rate. So we're going to use the same concept as the floating exchange rate. We're going to talk about Australia against the US dollar. And we're going to see that similarly the supply curve is upward sloping, the demand curve is downward sloping as per any market. But the fundamental value is here at say E1. But if the government wants to overvalue it, they want the value of the exchange rate to be at E2. And so if we draw a horizontal line across, we can see that the supply of say the Australian dollar to the greenback is here at quantity S, we're going to call that, and the demand for the dollar by US or overseas residents is only at QD. And so now we can see, using simple supply and demand analysis, that there is in fact a surplus in supply. So supply exceeds demand. QS exceeds QD. And so over time, this should theoretically move towards this equilibrium point here. So how does the government actually fix the exchange rate at E2? And we can see that there are many consequences for fixing the exchange rate at E2. It could have an effect on imports, it could have an effect on exports, it could have an effect on the overall living standards of the economy. But we're not going to go into deep analysis of why the government chooses to fix the exchange rate above its fundamental value in this lecture. We're just going to look at how the government may act to increase the fundamental exchange rate to an overvalued exchange rate. Okay. So the government can't actually take money from circulation. What they're going to do here is they're going to act as a net buyer of the Australian currency. And by acting as a net buyer, the government can manipulate the demand curve so that it shifts to the right. So the government will intervene into the market and increase the demand from D1 to D2 here. D2. And as we can see, if they shift the demand curve to the right, supply will eventually meet demand at this new equilibrium point or equilibrium price traded here. So the government would act to buy securities, so they would act to buy securities, Australian securities in the market, and therefore act as a net demand or a net buyer of the Australian currency. And as we know, when demand increases, it pushes the price up as according to the law of demand. So what this means is that the government will push the exchange rate up from E1 to E2. So that's the first scenario, when the currency is fixed at an overvalued price. Now secondly, we're going to look at an undervalued exchange rate. And this bears the same analysis as an overvalued exchange rate. Instead of being a net buyer though, the government's going to be a net seller of the exchange rate. And when we talk about the government, we're talking about the RBA. So it's not really the government, it's a subsidiary of the government. So we know that equilibrium, or the fundamental value of the exchange rate, lies at E1, which is also called the fundamental exchange rate, fundamental value of the exchange rate. So if the government wants to undervalue this exchange rate, they want to value it as, say, E3 here. What they would need to do, or what this means, is that because the exchange rate is so low, the overall supply is at QS, whereas the demand for the dollar is at QD. And as we can see, using supply-demand analysis, there is actually a shortage of the Australian dollar, because quantity demanded exceeds quantity supply. So not everyone is happy at this point. So what the government can do, or what the RBA can do, is they can print out more money. So the RBA here acts as a net seller of, or net supplier of the Australian dollar. And what this means is they can shift the supply curve to the right to S1 from S0 here, and therefore meet a new equilibrium point here at the quantity demanded at the new undervalued exchange rate price at E3. So we can talk about fixing an exchange rate at an overvalued or an undervalued price. And for an overvalued price, the government can act as a net buyer so as to increase the demand here from D1 to D2. But if the government wants to undervalue its exchange rate, then it can act as a net seller and print more money out so that the supply of the Australian dollar increases in the foreign exchange market from S0 here to S1, and that would depress or depreciate the fundamental exchange rate. So that's how the government can fix our exchange rate.